right, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Khan. I'm an assistant professor in political science at Yale University, and I want to warmly welcome you all on behalf of the Yale South Asia Studies Council to this special virtual panel titled Parliament, Politics and Possibilities in Pakistan. I want to thank the chair of the South Asia Studies Council, Professor Rohit Dey, for conceiving of this panel of political scientists and legal scholars to help make sense and provide some context for recent political events in Pakistan. I also want to thank the South Asia Studies Council Director, Dr. Kasturi Gupta, Amar Al-Heather, and Ryan Martinez for their work on bringing this together on such short notice. Before I turn to our panelists and tell you a little bit about the structure of today's event, just a few words of context to set the scene and why we've put this together. So the last few days have seen a really breakneck pace of political developments in Pakistan. And to sum up very quickly, yesterday, Shehbaz Sharif from the Pakistan Muslim League N was elected as the 23rd Prime Minister of Pakistan after 174 members of the National Assembly voted in his favor. This was preceded by the now former Prime Minister Imran Khan losing a vote of no confidence with 174 members voting in the 342 strong House in favor of the no confidence motion. Now, the passing of this motion came after the country's Supreme Court ruled that the Deputy Speaker of the House acted unconstitutionally in blocking the process, and that Imran Khan's subsequent dissolving of the parliament too was unconstitutional. In a landmark unanimous verdict late last Thursday, the court restored the House. When the assembly convened again on Saturday, voting was yet again delayed. Imran Khan himself was absent from parliament. And finally, the deputy speaker and speaker tendered resignations, and voting finally commenced just prior to midnight on Sunday. So there's a lot to unpack here, how this moment came to be, why it is that no prime minister in Pakistan has ever completed a 5-year term, the significance of the Supreme Court decision that made it all possible, and what this means for the future of democracy in Pakistan. So for all of that and more, we're joined by a fantastic panel of scholars who study Pakistani politics from a variety of lenses and approaches. And I'm going to turn straight to each of them for brief opening remarks. Following that, I'll pose a few questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. For Q&A, you should be able to see a Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And so if you can type in your questions as you come up with them, I will turn to those at the end of the panel when we open it up. So our first panelist today is Maryam S. Khan, who is a socio-legal scholar on South Asia and a resident research fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives in Pakistan. Maryam's interests and projects relate to comparative constitutional law, history and sociology of legal professions, judicialization, and legal mobilization in authoritarian contexts. She is presently the Pakistan country lead for a 5-year Economic and Social Research Council project on sustaining power for women's rights in South Asia. And her current book project, one that motivated her to pursue a doctoral degree in law at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, is on Pakistan's Constitution of 1973, involving archival research and oral history of the socio-political foundations and processes of constitution making. And of course, the 1973 Constitution has been something of a protagonist in last week's political drama. So I'll turn to Maryam to talk to us about placing this moment and the Supreme Court decision in a broader context of Pakistan's constitutional history, and what role constitutions play in a hybrid regime such as Pakistan's. Over to you, Maryam.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that introduction, and a quick word of thanks to both Professor Sarah Khan and Professor Rohit Dey for having me on this panel. I'm really delighted and enthused to be here. Since I have to talk about constitutional evolution in Pakistan in something like less than 10 minutes, I think what I'm going to try and do is to restrict my comments to what I think is a helpful way of looking at what we refer to as the hybrid regime in Pakistan, and how the constitution fits into that conversation and why we think it's important. So what I hope to do is really to lay down a larger conceptual frame for this conversation, for understanding the current parliamentary and constitutional crisis. And then perhaps, in the Q&A, I could maybe flesh out some of the points that I raise. So I'll start by saying that, what really struck me during PTI's rule of the past 3 years was this popularization of the idea of a hybrid regime. This is a term which has been coming up repeatedly, and this usage, I think, denotes a very widespread perception of a deep alignment that existed of interests between the political wing of the military, and more specifically, that's the Army High Command, and the civilian government. In common parlance, we've also been hearing the term "on the same page," which essentially expresses the same reality, that the PTI was, in a way, the king's party, if you will, and really just a civilian facade for the military. But I'd like to suggest that the idea of a hybrid regime is much more than that. I think it's rooted in our constitutional politics since at least the 1990s, and far from being limited to a particular government, I would argue that the hybrid regime is in fact the status quo. It's a kind of gray structure, if you will, of political power in Pakistan. So it's a structure in which power sharing between military and civilian forces has to be episodically renegotiated against the backdrop of a state that is maintained primarily by military power. Now, some iteration or the other of the civil military nexus in politics has existed in Pakistan, we all know, since the middle of the 1950s. But the hybrid regime in particular is a distinct form of political organization that we can situate actually in the post-Zia era. This is a period which also overlapped with the end of the Cold War, if you recall, and the emergence of a global tilt towards neoliberalism. And the rise of neoliberalism is not a minor detail in this story, right? Because it brought along with it formidable international pressures to democratize. So economic liberalization was meant to go hand in hand with political liberalization, or at least a semblance of it, so that authoritarian regimes around the globe found themselves compelled in some way or the other to hold elections and set up other institutions associated with democratic systems as a means of conferring legitimacy on their rule. Comparatively speaking, if you look at the spectrum of hybrid regimes around the world, which are those that combine some authoritarian or autocratic elements with democratic elements, you see that among the central features of these regimes are multi-party elections. And Pakistan's political trajectory maps quite well onto this global trend, first through the 90s, as we saw, and then in the 2000s, even under General Pervez Musharraf, who, unlike Zia, called party-based elections within 3 years of his coup. Now, within this hybrid regime framework, the Pakistan military has built up its own strategic repertoire for engineering the process of political liberalization. So sometimes you'll see it propping up a king's party, other times you'll see it destabilizing elected governments, but ultimately it will try in some way or the other to control electoral politics, and with it, the democratic cycle. Now, it's through this process of hybrid regime electoral competition, if you will, that the political function of the constitutional courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, has evolved from its primary focus on legitimizing military dictatorships to assuming a much more complex role as a kind of broker between the deep state and civilian politics. And this is why we continue in the recent past to see a very Janus-based kind of Supreme Court that is difficult to insulate from the political current of the moment. So that's the broad sort of historical sweep. And in that context, I think that the degree of civil military alignment that we witnessed during the PTI rule is not typical of Pakistan's hybrid regime. I'd argue that for the most part, at least in recent memory, we've seen civil-military relations that range from a kind of, uncomfortable modus vivendi to a completely open rift, which is why it seemed that at least in the first 2 to 3 years, the PTI government stood out as a kind of populist face of the military regime, which frankly has not done a good job either of remaining in the shadows in this past term. Most of the times, however, I think one would be able to distinguish the government from the military regime, but this distinction seemed really to collapse with PTI in power in 2018. Now, I refer to this for convenience sake as the same page hybrid regime, right? So not if you wanted to give a particular sort of label to this, this would be a same page hybrid regime, which in some ways has proved to be even more tyrannical, I would argue, than a direct military coup-driven government, for the reason that it has effectively mobilized the coercive apparatus of the state against its citizens virtually unchecked. It has achieved this on the basis of a very right-wing populism, albeit I would say a pseudo-populism that finally failed to maintain even a bare majority in the assembly after 3 odd years of being on that same page. So we saw relentless repression and witch hunting against all kinds of political dissent, not just the political opposition, but progressive political and social movements, civil rights and human rights groups, journalists, academics, students, women and gender minorities, various other marginalized social and ethnic groups. And this regime, I think, has told us a story of the disturbing levels of state tyranny that await us whenever the civil-military equation is a little too smooth. So I think the same page hybrid regime has really kind of thrown up a number of interesting sort of implications and contradictions in the system. Now that brings me to my second big point, and my last point actually, about how to think about the Constitution and its utility for creating some political space for democratic activity in a hybrid regime like Pakistan. Notice that I don't talk about consolidation, I just talk simply about a space for democratic activity. And the key thing to recognize is the asymmetry of the civil-military relationship. This is the principal fault line in our system. And it's rare, I think, to have a same page hybrid regime all the time. It happens only rarely. And so against that backdrop, I think the Constitution is the only formal site for political parties and groups to keep a foothold in the country's power structure. It's worth remembering that our Constitution does not provide for any express political prerogatives to the military, which I think makes it all the more important to guard the Constitution as a site of contestation for sustaining civilian political power. So even though one may be skeptical of the Supreme Court's expedience in pronouncing in favor of a parliamentary process, I think that it's only through an incremental accumulation of formal constitutional norms that we can hope to put constraints on the military's de facto power. But having said that, I must also add that the Constitution does not make any false promises, right? It does not promise on its own to change the material realities of this power. It's only as good as the politics around it. So when we talk of democratic consolidation, then we have to go beyond the power map of the Constitution, right, which we've been talking about. We have to think not only then in terms of political parties and elections, but in terms more broadly of sustained social and political movements, which can then act as levers of constitutional and social change. So I'm going to stop right there. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maryam. And keeping with the theme of constitutionalism, next up we have Yasser Kureshi. Yasser is a postdoctoral fellow in constitutional law and constitutional theory with Trinity College and the program for the Foundations of Law and Constitutional Government at the University of Oxford. His book, Courting Power, examines the emergence of Pakistan's assertive judiciary and is forthcoming this year with Cambridge University Press. This book builds on his dissertation titled Judging the Generals, completed at Brandeis University, which was awarded the Edward S. Corbin Award for the best dissertation in public law by the American Political Science Association in 2019. Yasser, I want to ask you to continue on the theme of constitutionalism, but perhaps from a slightly different angle of judicial politics, placing this moment in a broader history of the judiciary's role in Pakistan's politics, and also speak a little bit to how this most recent decision is being received by bar associations, which have been a focus of your work in the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. And it's great to be going after Maryam, because I think a lot of the ideas that I'm going to present complement exactly what Maryam said. And exactly what I will try to do is place the politics, place the actions taken by the court in the dramatic events of the last week in the context of how the courts have been operating and acting since 2018 and even before. And I think what I completely agree with what Maryam said is that in 2017-18, we saw in Pakistan's long history of hybridity, we saw a distinct form of hybridity emerge, right? Which we call the same page hybrid, as Maryam helpfully said. And I think what I want to point out is what was the idea of the same page? What was the point that all the institutions had to be on the same page on? And I think that was this idea that Pakistan's key problems lie in a corrupt political class entrenched in provincial centers of power and politicizing and undermining state institutions. And therefore, the institutions of government have to be snatched away from or purged of this political class as personified by the Sharifs and the Bhutto families, etc. Right? This understanding. Now, where do the courts fit into this? Well, since 2007, and we've seen the political direction of the Pakistani state increasingly shaped by a judiciary. And I think in my research, I found two key aspects to the jurisprudence that emerged. One is an interest in consistently expanding its own authority and jurisdiction, which often led to confrontation with other branches of government. And two, a deep sense that politicians and the political class could not be trusted with the work of government and governance. And state institutions need to be released from the clutches of these politicians, and their actions need to be monitored. So the courts were in some ways also evolving a tutelary role for themselves, not entirely different from the one held by the military, though of course they did not wield the same level of authority or coercive tools that the military possessed. And so over the decade, from 2010 to 18, the PTI, Imran Khan's party, hitched its wagon to these two unelected institutions, the military and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court especially launched a campaign of anti-corruption jurisprudence targeting politicians on a range of cases, justifying interventions into the political system and institutions on the basis of the corruption and incompetence of the political parties, and even disqualifying prime ministers. And the military, as we know, used surveillance and strong arming to help weaken and fragment the Muslim League and PMLN. And the PTI benefited significantly from this jurisprudence and the actions of the military. And together we saw Imran Khan's anti-corruption populism, the Supreme Court's anti-politics jurisprudence, and the military's engineering set the stage for Imran Khan's electoral win in 2018. And all these three institutions seemed committed to purging the state's political institutions and of sort of the political parties of the past, the Muslim League, the PPP. And the interests all seemed to converge in one institution, NAB, the National Accountability Bureau, that was weaponized to hound the opposition with corruption allegations and carry out essentially a witch hunt of the opposition. But the issue was, with this same page established, it had to be maintained. So to ensure the judiciary played its role in this structure, we saw high courts come under increasing pressure from the Supreme Court and the military. And the result of this pressure was that detention applications made by the executive against opposition politicians or bail applications made by opposition politicians, their success or failure could almost be predicted based on shifts in the approach taken by the executive towards different opposition parties and politicians. But at the same time, within the Supreme Court, the military and the PTI tried to ensure that any judges who may not have been on the same page regarding this agenda could be tamed or removed. And so fragmentation appeared within the courts regarding its role in this same page hybrid. And we saw the case emerge against Justice Qazi Faiz Isa, who was seen as a more independent and not necessarily playing in line with this same page. And the efforts to remove him highlighted the fissures within the court and the efforts to bring the judiciary on the same page and the problems that produced. And this also really compromised the legitimacy of the Supreme Court among its key audiences like the bar associations, who mobilized in favor of Justice Qazi Faiz Isa. And as the years went by, as fatigue with anti-corruption witch hunts grew and the harmonious relationship between Imran and the army frayed, there was growing space for the courts to place some limits on some of the worst excesses of the system. But that brings us to the key decision we saw last week. So what happened was, when Imran Khan had his deputy speaker declare reject the vote of no confidence, and on that basis dissolve the assemblies and call for elections, when this issue was immediately taken to the Supreme Court. And watching the decision, there were several concerns everybody had. It was a 5-member bench rather than a full bench. It included several judges who had historically been some of the most willing participants in the same page, willing members of an anti-corruption jurisprudence that had pillaged PTI and targeted its opposition. And so there were apprehensions. To most observers, there was no real legal justification that could be found for the actions of the PTI's deputy speaker. But in rejecting the vote of no confidence, but it was considered there were two routes the courts could take that would favor the PTI, and these routes were advocated by PTI's lawyers. The first was that parliamentary sovereignty and the separation of powers required that the courts should hold back from encroaching upon the actions of the speaker, as that would undermine parliamentary supremacy. And the second was that the court, fine, the actions of the speaker were clearly illegal, but you know what? Rather than overturning them, let's, in the national interest, allow for elections to proceed anyhow rather than restoring the assemblies. This kind of constitutional deviation being upheld by the court in the national interest reflected an older jurisprudence of the court that was used to uphold various actions taken by military leaders, actions which may not have had constitutional sanction, but were deemed necessary for the national interest. Now, this line of jurisprudence has been one of the most unfortunate legacies of the judiciary's history, and what with bar associations around the country have vocally opposed, right? But a few factors became clear during the court's proceedings that may explain how it made its decision. First, in accepting the petition, the court made explicit reference to the Sindh High Court Bar Association decision, a decision where the court unequivocally had stated that the doctrine of necessity was dead and buried. Perhaps a signal now in hindsight that the court did not want to associate itself with that legacy again. Secondly, during the proceedings, arguments regarding parliamentary sovereignty and supremacy did not go down well with the court. How could they? A court that has been looking to expand its interventions and its role and encroachments into elected political institutions was certainly not going to be sympathetic to an argument that called for restraint and respect for separation of powers. And third, the court had a real opportunity to reclaim its lost legitimacy, and this case was a real opportunity to do it. So the ruling made by the court made clear in no uncertain terms that the court's actions were unconstitutional and void, and all actions taken as a consequence were void. Now, on the event, now let's come to the events of the night night of Sunday, right, or Saturday. What made the events of the night of Imran Khan's final removal so fascinating, those last few hours, was the way in which the Supreme Court now signaled its power and amidst all that was going on. First, as it became increasingly clear that Imran Khan was not going to let the vote of no confidence go through by midnight, as commanded by the court let it be known that it was opening its doors at midnight, should the midnight deadline be breached. The speaker would then not only be in violation, he would immediately be held in contempt of court and face criminal charges. This was a power move by the court, making the cost of non-compliance with its orders all too great. And what it showed was just how much courts would be engaged and what they could do, and in any case, what it made apparent was the court was reminding Khan that there were no institutional routes left for him to save himself, right? Now, in the coming days and weeks, the courts are going to remain relevant, as the speaker has now sent the famous letter said to confirm the foreign conspiracy to the Supreme Court and demanded the Chief Justice investigate it. And what remains to be seen is, will the courts bite? They have in the past. Will they do it this time? But I think what we have to realize, and at the end, what I want to say is this: what the regime of and politics in the last few years have represented was a particular endeavor to depoliticize the state, purge its political class, and legitimize its purging through the use of constitutional courts and a populist anti-politics party, the PTI. Ultimately, the institutional coalition making this possible fell apart, and this mission of depoliticization failed. And the military and even the judiciary have readjusted and recalibrated to that recognition, while the PTI feels abandoned. But the hybridity remains. There are two unelected institutions seeking to play two very different kinds of consequential tutelary roles in the system. How they engage with each other and with the elected institutions and political parties will define Pakistan's political structure, hybrid politics, and political future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yasser. And you said a little bit about the alleged foreign conspiracy, and I want to shift gears slightly away from the Supreme Court decision to this exactly. And for that, I want to turn now to Fahd Humayun, who is a PhD candidate at the Political Science Department at Yale, where he studies the domestic drivers of international conflict and security crises in South Asia. Starting this fall, Fahd will be an instructor at Tufts University's Department of Political Science before being an assistant professor at Tufts Political Science in January 2023. Fahd, I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about broadly the role of foreign policy in all of this, particularly the evolution of Khan's foreign policy throughout his term, its role in bringing him to this moment, and the extent to which his narrative of foreign intervention in his ousting through the vote of no confidence is a credible one, and what role you think it'll play in mobilizing his voters and party going forward.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and to Rohit, to both of you for organizing and steering this conversation. I think it's an important question. I think that while foreign policy has been a centralizing theme in this recent crisis, I also think it's worth remembering that when we think about the events of the last few days, it's useful to remember that concerns over foreign policy have historically been very much embedded in both civil military tensions in Pakistan and the extent to which external stressors spill over into internal stressors, leading to political confrontation at various points in Pakistan's checkered democratic history. I think the first question to ask is, why has foreign policy been so pertinent to this particular crisis? And I think a useful starting point for this is thinking about how Imran Khan campaigned in both the 2013 and then in the 2018 general elections. So Imran Khan came to power in 2018 very much sort of accusing his political rivals, the PMLN and the People's Party, of sort of having compromised on Pakistan's sovereignty, for having allied Pakistan with the West in the war in Afghanistan, which was, domestically unpopular, politically unpopular in Pakistan. And Imran Khan criticized the existing political classes for very much having acquiesced to US counter-terror operations in Pakistan, including drone strikes. So if you remember, in both the 2013 and the 2018 general election, the PTI mobilized support around this, taking a very sort of firm position on US drone strikes. I also think it's very useful to locate these particular policy positions in Imran Khan's long-held stance on the war in Afghanistan itself. So in the war in Afghanistan, Imran Khan has sort of consistently held that there can't be any military solution, there has to be a political solution. And I don't think this won him any favors in, within the US security establishment. So the Americans, I think, came to the realization that the war in Afghanistan could only sort of be resolved through a political settlement. They came to this sort of realization belatedly. And even now, I think there's this sense that Pakistan could have done more to sort of have preventing the Taliban from coming to power. At the same time, the paradox here is that when Imran Khan came to power, part of the promise was to sort of improve Pakistan's standing on the international stage, improving Pakistan's reputation. And of course, this necessitated and compelled greater engagement, not less engagement, with the United States. The problem here, though, was that until August 2020, the US was still very much involved in Afghanistan and was overwhelmingly focused on trying to withdraw from the country. And so Imran Khan's hope was that post-withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Biden administration might actually see the utility of engaging with Pakistan on its own terms. But I think there was a lot of disappointment within the PTI, that engagement post-US withdrawal from Afghanistan has been minimal. There's been very little senior level interaction between the two sides, barring a meeting between the two NSAs. And the irony here somewhat is that despite that, that sort of absence of high level engagement between, or the visible sort of engagement that the PTI wanted with the United States, Pakistan's relationship with the United States continues to be an important relationship. So the US is Pakistan's largest trading partner. It was in 2019 under the PTI that Pakistan sort of got an IMF loan, a $6 billion rescue package, which was necessary to stabilize the Pakistani economy. I think it's also very useful and interesting to sort of think about COVID response and the role that the United States has played in COVID response in Pakistan. So Pakistan has been the recipient of, I think, 50 million US-sponsored COVID vaccines. So one of the things that the PTI takes credit for, which is like having sort of deftly navigated the pandemic with a little more dexterity than I think had been anticipated, it's sold very much as a PTI win, but it's also something which I think couldn't have been done without coordination and collaboration with the United States. The reason that all of this becomes complicated is that because as another thing that Imran Khan tried to do as part of his foreign policy was to, I think, very much diversify Pakistan's portfolio of engagements. So Pakistan already has a sort of very deep and a deepening, in fact, relationship with China, which is, I think, a source of tension given the state of Sino-US tensions at the moment. But Pakistan was also looking to sort of expand its relationship with Russia. And that, I think, sort of, provides the context or the backdrop for Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Moscow on the eve of the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which very quickly became contentious within Pakistan because of the allegation that the PTI had that there was pressure from the US and from the EU on Pakistan, not to visit, on Prime Minister Imran Khan to not visit Moscow at the time that he did. And also afterwards, there was pressure on Pakistan, alleged by the PTI for Pakistan to not take a neutral stance on this and to criticize Russia's actions. And this then, I think, became something of a lightning rod for Imran Khan to talk about, these external attempts to subvert Pakistan's sovereignty, symbolized very much in the contents of this letter, this cable from the Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, expressing reservations, expressing American reservations about Imran Khan and Pakistan's foreign policy. Now, while I think there's going to be this inquiry, and I think it's very important for, I think, political tensions right now in Pakistan, for the contents of that letter to really be investigated. My sense is that the PTI has taken a somewhat liberal interpretation of the contents of that letter, sort of suggesting that the United States was pushing for regime change. And that's sort of the rhetoric that we're seeing Imran Khan now use, both on Twitter, and he's scheduled to address a rally in Peshawar tomorrow. I expect we'll see similar kinds of, expressions being used to describe the foreign hand in this recent crisis. Now, interestingly enough, foreign policy hasn't historically been a mobilizer in Pakistan's politics. So Dr. Niloufer Siddiqui, for instance, has done work showing that foreign policy has low issue salience for Pakistani voters. But I suspect that the PTI is attempting to politically mobilize support around not really foreign policy as much as it's trying to mobilize support now around the issue of the country's sovereignty. And it's going to be looking to hyphenate claims of sovereignty to claims of legitimacy to mobilize its support base in the coming weeks. So for instance, in my own research, I find that anti-Western sentiment in Pakistan is more polarizing politically and publicly than is anti-India sentiment. And I suspect that it's that kind of partisan tribalism that the PTI is very much going to try and cash in on and is looking to bank on in its push for early elections. So I'll stop there, but I look forward to question and answers, and thank you again for this this great conversation.
Thank you so much, Fahd. And that's a perfect segue into our last speaker to talk about really the PTI voters and party strategy. So we have, last but not least, Niloufer Siddiqui, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University at Albany, State University of New York. Niloufer completed her PhD in political science at Yale in 2017. She's co-editor of a volume on Pakistan's political parties, and her own book project, Under the Gun, Political Parties and Violence in Pakistan, is under contract with Cambridge University Press. And it examines why political parties engage in violence and the variation in the violence strategies that they employ. Her other research interests include political behavior, politics of religion and ethnicity, electoral dynamics, in transitioning democracies, and voters and foreign policy. So Niloufer, drawing on your expertise in political behavior, I'd love for you to speak to the question of what the vote of no confidence means for PTI voters and for the electoral strength of the PTI going forward, and what we can make of the protests we've seen immediately following the results of the vote.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I just want to start by saying that I'm really happy to be having this conversation with all of you. You know, it's been a rather overwhelming few days, to say the least. And so I'm happy to be here to try and process some of this information, some of the my own thoughts alongside all of you. I should also state at the outset that my own reactions to this are developing and changing. And so, you know, I'm as curious as anybody as to how all of this unfolds over the short and medium term. But, you know, all that being said, in my comments today, as Sarah explained, I wanted to bring voters back into the conversation a little bit. You know, given that much of what we have seen unfold over the last few weeks focuses on the other important institutions in society. So the political parties themselves, the military, the Supreme Court. Yet we saw that a very large number of PTI supporters took to the streets, you know, in a number of cities and towns around the country on Sunday night after the no confidence vote. And while these were to an extent concentrated in the urban centers we would expect, you know, so Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, Peshawar, even smaller districts saw considerable turnout. And many were surprised by this, you know, given that much of the conversation, at least in academic and policy circles, has highlighted, as it should, the role of the military in bringing the PTI to power in the 2018 elections. But I think what the protests demonstrate is that the PTI does maintain a sizable support base in the country. So of course, no one can argue convincingly that political parties competed on an even playing field in 2018. But even as we acknowledge the role that the military played, it's important to note that the PTI nonetheless showed it was a very viable third option to the PPP and PMLN, who have long dominated civilian politics in the country. And it did, you know, as Fahad pointed to, bring a lot of hope to a previously unmobilized segment of society. You know, so according to Gallup Pakistan exit poll data from 2018, the PTI voter was not that different from the average voter in the country. It was somewhat younger and urban, but not by much. It was somewhat more educated and wealthier, but again, not by much. And so I think what we saw was really these two simultaneous trends occurring. One involved a group of more urban, more educated people who were mobilized by PTI's anti-corruption and anti-Western narrative. But the second was a continuation of the old politics of Purana Pakistan, you know, with electables switching from the PMLN or the PPP to the PTI and bringing their vote bank with them, continuing the patron-client politics with which we are so familiar with in Pakistan. I'm sure that more will be clear in the coming days, you know, but some preliminary survey data shows that the PTI did lose a considerable amount of support over the last 12 months or so in the face of a quickly and seriously deteriorating economy. So in a survey I conducted in 2021, PTI was cited as the most likely party respondents would vote for. But by early 2022, PMLN had taken over the top spot. However, more recent polling numbers from the last few days shows that perhaps there is a bit of a sympathy bump for the PTI since Khan's ouster. So, you know, how do we reconcile these findings or these trends? Sunday's events very much show that those turning out in large numbers do remain mobilized by Imran Khan's populist narrative and demonstrates that this foreign regime change conspiracy is resonating among some. But I think it remains an open question as to whether this segment speaks for the Pakistani voter more broadly. As Fahad mentioned, study after study has shown that the vast majority of voters in Pakistan do not appear to vote for parties on the basis of these ideologies and narratives. And for them, patronage politics remains supreme. So in a survey that Christopher Clary and I conducted, we found that foreign policy, specifically policy towards India, is the least significant factor among 5 that were tested in determining voting behavior. And of course, foreign policy in non-crisis times is likely to be less resonant than during these sorts of polarized moments. But I think I do expect these trends to generally hold for a large segment of Pakistani society. And so I think what we are seeing demonstrates both the sizable support base for the PTI, but does not necessarily mean that they would win if elections were held tomorrow. At the same time, and this brings me to my second point, this does not mean that the evolving narrative that is being put forward by the PTI is not significant. So Imran Khan's current narrative of a foreign conspiracy of an imported government, appears on the surface of it perhaps a bit different from the narrative leading up to 2018. On the other hand, it should be seen as the same, the other side of the same coin of the anti-corruption platform on which he contested. Both narratives paint the opposition as being anti-Pakistani citizen, as putting the personal interests of an outsider or the elite above the interests of the average citizen of the Admi. But this sort of populist narrative, steeped in nationalist sentiment and relying on conspiracy theories, has damaging consequences. So there's a rich literature which highlights the negative impact of nationalism on a whole host of outcome measures, whether it's hawkishness or support for military action. And in research that I'm currently doing with Asfandi Armir, we find, through a nationally representative survey, we find causal evidence that nationalist sentiment can increase belief in conspiracies that rights-seeking minority groups are subversives. So that is, when exposed to nationalist prompts, even nationalist prompts that evoke an internal unity, respondents were more likely to believe that ethnic minorities demanding rights were seeking to undermine the nation with help from foreign actors. And in another survey, conducted just a few months ago, we further find that nationalist individuals are more likely to believe that minorities and women are already accorded sufficient rights in Pakistan, and that it is the duty of the average Pakistani to showcase only a positive face of the country. And my own work from a few years ago has shown that voters are more likely to believe conspiracy theories when they are endorsed by their own political party. All of this means that the narrative that the PTI is relying on has consequences beyond just distrust of the US. And I would wager that it doesn't bode well for women or minority groups in the country going forward. So to conclude, what does this say about the role of political parties and the consolidation of democracy in Pakistan? So, on the one hand, I find it personally a bit disappointing that we have to continue to live with this fact, as Sarah started us off with today, that no prime minister has completed his or her term in parliament. I think there's a lot to gain from sticking to election schedules and going through these democratic motions. On the other hand, I think has also been covered quite well in this panel today, the last few years of rule in Pakistan did suggest a decrease in the space provided to the opposition, provided to the media, provided to any critics of the regime. And so I do not lament the end of the PTI regime, even as I remain a bit apprehensive of the future. But I'm sure this is a question we're going to take up more in the Q&A, and so I'll stop here.
Great, thank you so much, Niloufer. So we have about half an hour for Q&A, and I'm going to start off with a couple of questions from the panel, and I see that some of you are putting questions in the Q&A, so I'll pick those up after and also just call on you to state those questions to the panel. So I want to start with a comparative politics 101 question that has come up in the last few days, which is some genuine confusion between the terms regime and government in both political analysis and leaders' rhetoric. And I don't want to restate the difference for this audience or this panel, but there is some speculation, optimism that this moment might actually signal the end of at least a particular form of military-civilian arrangement that characterizes Pakistan's hybrid regime. So I'm wondering what all of you make of that optimism or prediction? And really, this is an open question for any of you to take up. Yasser, did you want to start us off? Go ahead.
Well, okay. So thanks, Sarah. It's a question. This question about the, what does this bode for optimism about the future? And I think I have been someone who was a little more optimistic maybe about the prospects of what the vote of no confidence and the subsequent actions by the courts could represent. I think it is important to sense, and I think Niloufer mentioned that, a possibility for space opening up for more opposition participation and contestation in a way that has been undermined in the last few years. I think it is fair to say that if we think about hybrid regimes in Pakistan, the terms of the hybridity that emerged between Imran Khan's PTI and the military will not be the same as what we see in the coming years with these political parties. These are political parties with a different history, a different set of constituencies, and a different history of relationships with the military that make it unlikely that we're going to see the same kind of configuration we saw in the last 3 years, right? But the problems remain of the legitimacy of the new arrangement, right? As Niloufer pointed out, PTI has significant support in the country, significantly mobilized constituencies, and this narrative amongst particularly consequential and privileged groups in Pakistani society that the political leadership of these parties is corrupt, incompetent, and now traitors does sell well, and these constituencies, even if they do not guarantee electoral victories for PTI, are constant pressure groups and consequential pressure groups in Pakistani politics, in institutional politics. And so the legitimacy crisis that the new dispensation will face is always going to complicate the future of the kinds of relationships it will have with the military and the amount it may have to lean on the military in the future as well. And then, yeah, so I'll leave it at that, but these are some of the thoughts I had. Yeah.
Yeah, so if I could...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Maryam. Go ahead.
So let's start with Maryam, and then Niloufer will come back to you.
Thank you. Sorry for cutting you off. But I think that just, building on some of Yasser's theme, I think, so I think at one level, of course, we all have to think in terms of the politics of hope, because that is what sustains us in our research. But I think at another level, what I see happening, at least for the short to medium term, is a fragmentation of politics. And by that, I'm referring to a situation where instead of big sort of national parties, you're going to have now more splinter political groups, particularly if the Punjab vote is divided between the PTI and the PMLN. You will see a kind of calculus emerging within the military regime, and that is a word that I frankly tend to, only use for military power in Pakistan. There is a kind of association with the term regime that kind of keeps going back to Ayub and Yahya and Zia and Musharraf. So it's hard to kind of get rid of that association in our context. But if you look at the military regime calculus around the electoral process, even before the 90s, if you go back to the 1970 general election, which was our first direct general election, you look at an interesting logic which has to do really only simply with numbers. So there's this notion that there will be a split vote in East Pakistan and in West Pakistan, and what you will eventually require is a kind of fragile coalition government at the center, which then a military executive will be able to easily manipulate to its own advantage. And that's the kind of equilibrium that I sort of fear for Pakistan going onwards, which is why I think while it's really important to now focus also on local government, I think that we also need more strengthening of national parties, which can actually produce the kinds of electoral outcomes that scale up, right? And don't remain so splintered and fragmented, that there is some level of cohesion and consensus, I think, which would be really important in order to sustain civilian power, which can, to some level at least, check the military's de facto role. Otherwise, what you get are unstable coalitions. It's a fantastic opportunity for the military to intervene in various different forms. So not just through coups, of course, I think that's really not the priority anymore. But of course, various forms of judicial coups. 58-2B is out, but 62 and 63 are still in. And as Yasser also implied, with the latest Supreme Court decision, it's not as if this is just a win for constitutional or parliamentary politics. This is also a win for the Supreme Court. It has created a new precedent for the Supreme Court intervening in actually enforcing a vote of no confidence in the assembly. So that's a huge jump for judicial power. The situation, unfortunately, actually, in terms of the hybrid regime, gets a little more complex. It's the reverse of a same-page hybrid regime. It's a nobody's on the same page hybrid regime, which is actually a win for the hybrid regime itself.
Niloufer, go ahead. Great.
So I just offer quickly a few thoughts on to echo Maryam and Yasser's points. On the one hand, I think, if we were to step back a little bit, we could say, we have seen all this before to some extent, right? Imran Khan situation, not particularly novel. A civilian leader gets support from the military, then has it falling out based on either policy or personal differences. Then the opposition capitalizes, and then we have a new government, right? So there is a sense to which, a lot of people would argue that this is just history repeating itself. On the other hand, as I think has already been said quite well, this regime was perhaps more hybrid than other hybrid regimes, right? That the space that was provided to undemocratic acts was more extreme and maybe more foreboding for the future and what could happen if this experiment was allowed to continue. And then, again, as Yasser mentioned, on the one hand, having the symbolism of a Sharif holding this, position of prime minister once again, given, what attracted Imran Khan to so many people, is not great, right? So this kind of desire for something new and for not the same old, a return to that, I think, does suggest that some of the issues in Purana Pakistan are continuing. On the other hand, I do think that this is ultimately about governance, and there is an extent to which, some people are arguing that maybe Shehbaz Sharif can, outgovern the civil military crisis. And so I think there will be a lot of focus, as I think there should be, on just governing a country that's really suffering from many, many real problems, distinct from these kind of broader conceptual issues as well. And then you're just finally, continuing in this mode of on the one hand, and on the other, on the one hand, we find that, bringing the PTI supporters out on the streets, is good in the sense that it shows that people are really rallying behind the civilian leader, even when the civilian leader and the establishment have a falling out, right? And so it seems like a very genuine outpouring, and that I think is a good thing. It's a silver lining. On the other hand, it's not great that they're being rallied on the basis of, this kind of populist nationalist narrative for the reasons that I highlighted when I spoke a few minutes earlier. So obviously I have very mixed thoughts about what the future holds.
Fahd, did you want to come in on this point?
Just a quick point to add, which is I think while I don't have a definitive answer to your question, I think it's worth keeping in mind that Army Chief General Bajwa's term comes to an end in November. That's when Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif will have to appoint a new army chief. That's typically being, at least historically speaking, the site of civil military tensions between the Sharifs and the military establishment. And I think it'll probably be clear the extent to which we're seeing more of the same or a break from the past based on who Shehbaz Sharif picks. I also think it's not unreasonable to sort of expect that both Mohammad Nawaz Sharif and Maryam Nawaz will want to say in who the successor to General Bajwa is. And I think both Nawaz Sharif and Maryam Nawaz have also been more confrontational with the military establishment than Shehbaz Sharif himself is. So I think the PMLN itself could be contain, some friction over, could contain the seeds for some civil military dysfunction within itself as well.
Great, thank you. So I think we're going to go right ahead into the audience questions, which are coming in very quickly. And I'm going to take the liberty of sort of grouping them thematically. And so continuing with the theme of civil-military relations and the hybrid regime, I think there's two questions, Ayaz Bukhari's first question and then Colin Cookman's question. And so I'm going to give you each speaker privileges if you'd just like to ask the question that you've put in the chat. So Ayaz, you should be able to unmute yourself and go ahead with your first question.
Hi, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to the panel for a very interesting conversation thus far. My question is on the issue of civil supremacy and the perpetuity of the hybrid regime status quo, as Maryam has mentioned. We know that the civilian supremacy is something that the political parties are struggling for and fighting for, but I don't see them having created greater space for themselves over the last 3 or 4 decades. Where do you see this going?
Thank you. So we'll group that together with Colin Cookman's question, which is also on civil-military relations. Colin, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for this discussion. I'm wondering if the panelists could speak to the military itself as an actor and the degree to which you assess it to be more of a multipolar entity or more of a hierarchical single entity, and thinking here specifically about at least at the top level, if we assess that the military has sort of rejected the partnership with Khan, to what degree, as he's sort of campaigning now to return to power, to what degree he may or may not find partners within the establishment. I guess it could include the judicial establishment as well, broader than just the military there. But your thoughts on that would be appreciated. Thanks.
Great, thank you both. So any one of the panelists who wants to pick up on either of those questions, please go ahead. Yasser, go ahead.
I can go in unless Maryam wants to come first. Since the first question was addressed to some of her thoughts on hybrid regime. But otherwise I can come in whenever. So
why don't you start us off?
Sure. Well, so I primarily wanted to address some of what Colin was saying about the military, and of course the military is and the military judicial establishment. Of course, the military is very hard to read from the outside, and that's always been the case. But I think one way I'm trying to think about this, and I'd be interested to hear what others think, and including the others in the audience, is to distinguish between military's institutional interest and institutional ideology, right? And sometimes these, the military has an institutional interest in particular foreign policy relationships, in a particular positioning in power, but it's also legitimized that role through a particular ideological positioning regarding the, political parties, regarding disdain for political classes, regarding disdain for provincialism, subnationalism, etc., right? And so what the PTI in some ways represented and why its relationship with the military seems so successful is because it really crystallized the ideology that has driven so much of military interventionism in the past. That disdain for the sharifs, the bhuttos, the politicians, the political class, the provincial parties, etc., right? And so for the institutional ideology of the military so well aligns with PTI and Imran Khan's ideology that I think this creates a real friction within the military, right? If so many troops have been indoctrinated in ideas that resonate so well with Imran Khan's politics, then it creates a real challenge for the military to figure out how do we maintain our institutional interests when the politicians who best align with our ideological positioning, that our rank and file, that our officers have been sort of indoctrinated on, when those clash, right? And so I think we're going to see over time how the military manages that. And I don't think it's going to be an easy task. The military is known to be a highly hierarchical institution that consolidates power, builds discipline within its ranks. but it's going, I think it will be a tougher challenge. And I think Imran Khan thinks that there are elements in the military, there are groups who are so ideologically aligned with his positioning that they may well come to support him in the future. I'm not sure if he's right. I do think the military has instruments and structures to minimize dissent, control dissent, and consolidate the power of the leadership. But it will be a real challenge in the coming days. And I think the same is with the judiciary as well. I think, again, that anti-politics mind role conception is present there as well. And it will continue to inform some of the ways in which they interact with the political parties in the future, because it's also serving of their institutional interests. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Can I just dovetail one idea onto what Yasser has said, especially about the Supreme Court? And I think that to a great extent, I mean, there was a time right after the lawyers' movement when I think my view on this was that judges have managed to kind of perhaps create a more independent space for themselves. I think that has not proved to be the case entirely. I mean, there have been some maybe positive outcomes of that movement, but a divorce, if you will, from military influence has not been one of them. So I think that relationship, that nexus still remains very, very powerful. And I think that also has a lot to do with the fact that the Supreme Court Chief Justice holds a lot of, or rather concentrates a lot of power within his office, right? So you must have seen in the middle of what was happening in the past few days, some critiques arising, about the Chief Justice's role in bench formation. So the fact that the Chief Justice still has this power to actually make, to determine the size of the benches, to determine the composition of the bench, to determine conventions around when there will be a full bench or a full court, that sort of decision making really puts the Chief Justice squarely in the driver's seat. And to the extent that the Chief Justice, has been conscripted into the military's political agenda, I think it will be very difficult for the Supreme Court to actually assert a very independent sort of a viewpoint from the military regime of the day. As for the first question, I don't think it was necessarily only meant for me, Yasser. You could also come in on that, on the hybrid regime and the perpetuity, and whether I think that there's been any kind of positive evolution in that respect. I think that the very good thing that I've seen in the past 5 years with the rise in all of this contentious politics amongst various sort of collectives, you've seen the Aurat March arise, you've seen student movements and protests, you've seen ethnic groups mobilizing, and I think there are a lot of these pockets of small struggles and protest movements going on. And I think that if political parties are worth their salt, they will begin now to understand how important it is to attach to their political following a number of these small political and social movements, because without a larger sort of buy-in in the process at the grassroots level, it's really impossible for civilian supremacy to actually sustain any gains and move forward with them. There will always be this kind of backsliding. So I think more focus on working class groups, more focus on a lot of these social movements. This is the right time. This is the time when they're already motivated and mobilized, and what they require is attachment to a proper sort of organizational machinery to take their politics forward.
Thanks, Maryam, and Yasser for speaking to both those questions. I'm going to move on now to a group of questions on foreign policy and anti-Americanism, which I think are directed in part to Fahd and Niloufer. So first, let's start with quite a specific question from Rohail Salman. Rohail, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much, everybody, for a really nice talk. I learned a lot that I didn't know about, but specifically to Fahd, this question is about a more personal, egocentric foreign policy that Imran Khan tends to have pursued since he got into power, and this entire issue of him not getting a call from Joe Biden in the start, and how that became such an issue that he did bring it up again and again. And I was just wondering how a narrative that was set right at the start of the Biden presidency played into what happened with Imran Khan being willing to throw Biden and the US under the bus. How important do you think that personal level of diplomacy or personal level of foreign policy was for that purpose? And also wondering how much did that snub by the US affect popular perceptions of the US and Pakistan? Because up until the Afghanistan withdrawal, the position on the US wasn't necessarily very negative in the US, but in this last year or so, it has gotten steadily worse up until it was completely abandoned under Imran Khan in the end. So just your thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you, Ruhail. And we'll group this together with a question also in foreign policy from Nadia Hasib. Nadia, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for this talk. I think very, very useful and coming at a great time. Just wanted to check that Imran Khan's narrative, PTI's narrative around foreign policy, as Niloufer mentioned, is not very popular to the common man. And it hasn't been a deal breaker in any of the political parties before in the previous governments. Do you think this is changing, or this will still be significant enough for PTI to get enough votes in the future, be it a single point agenda, which PTI currently seems to have?
Thank you, Nadia. And then one last one in this group on the anti-American rhetoric, and this one comes from Saleha Kamal. Saleha, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for a very interesting discussion. So my question, I'm thinking about anti-Americanism and how it's been prevalent for a while. And of course, PTI has greatly gained from it, as you've all discussed. And this anti-Americanism kind of borrows indiscriminately from right-wing cultural opposition and more left-wing critiques of imperialism as well. And it's all like kind of rolled in together. So I'm wondering, do you think this anti-Americanism contributes to PTI's popularity within the Pakistani diaspora as well? So not just locally, but diaspora as well. And then do you see the future of anti-Americanism as a strategy playing out well for both PTI and other parties? And do you think it's likely to gain more steam or die out?
Great, thank you so much, Saleha, for that question. So perhaps let's turn to either Fahd and Niloufer on those, whichever one of you wants to go first. And then of course, Maryam and Yasser, if you have anything to add, feel free.
I could go first if that's okay, Niloufer. So to Ruhail's question first on the not receiving a telephone call from Biden. This has certainly been, I think, the PTI has, I think, milked this considerably, and we've seen this sort of, cited again and again in the popular media as, why hasn't Biden called? It's like, I think it was a slight to Imran Khan. Imran Khan did personalize foreign policy around his ego considerably, and I think in a very much in a sort of a populist manner. I think it's worth remembering in the same sort of, I think, breadth that even the PMLN before the PTI also did the same thing with foreign policy. I mean, it personalized foreign policy to the point where foreign policy decisions weren't being sort of taken institutionally. They weren't they weren't discussed in parliament. So this is actually the sort of the personalization of foreign policy is, I think, a structural problem that, strong prime ministers or prime ministers who conceive of themselves to be strong men in Pakistan, they like to play foreign policy very close to the chest. I think in Imran Khan's case, pride may certainly have been an exacerbating factor in that, because it's if you recall, Imran Khan had I would say, a relatively somewhat more constructive relationship with President Biden's predecessor, President Trump. And that was actually hailed in Pakistan as a very successful example of Pak-US, the Pak-US relationship sort of being out of the woods, both Prime Minister Imran Khan and President Trump getting on very well with each other when they met in the White House. And so I think with the Biden administration, there was definitely a sense of a disappointment, but also this feeling of, more could have been done and should have been done. And that Pakistan was actually being, I think, the feeling within the PTI was that Pakistan has sort of been put, in the naughty corner for not having been, having pulled its weight in the war in Afghanistan.
So I can jump in here. Thank you for those really great sets of questions. I think this will be kind of the question that we will all be debating, in the weeks that come, as to what extent, individuals or voters outside of urban centers are motivated in the same way as those within urban centers by Imran Khan's narrative, right? And his anti-Western and populist agenda and narrative. And I think, I don't know is the answer, the short answer, but I will say that, a few things for us to note is that the PTI did not actually manage to win until it adopted many of the strategies that other weakly institutionalized political parties have adopted in the past, right? And so by this, I mean turning to local elites and electables, relying on their vote bank, relying on like same old strategies of patron-client relations, which dominate much of rural Punjab, much of rural Sindh as well. And so I think that's important for us to remember, because it suggests, Imran Khan, as Fahd said earlier, always kind of had this like anti-drone platform, and it attracted lots of people, but the electoral success was actually kind of tied to electable politics. And so this suggests to me, at least, a limit as to like what extent ideology, which I don't doubt that if you ask people, do they believe or hold anti-Western opinion? I'm sure the answer is yes, right? Do they believe these conspiracies? Sure. But whether or not this translates into voting behavior, I think, is an entirely separate question. And I think, it's also a little bit distinct from the anti-corruption platform, because the anti-corruption platform, I think, also kind of explained or provided to the voters an explanation for why Pakistan's economy had done so poorly, right? It like painted the simple narrative of how the opposition leaders, the past civilian leaders were corrupt and, kept the money away from the ordinary citizen. And only if you were to get rid of this corruption, the country will prosper economically, right? And so I do think even that anti-corruption narrative might be more about a person's day-to-day life than this anti-Western narrative. And so I guess I am skeptical that this alone will be sufficient, right? But that doesn't mean that we're not seeing trends, right? So we're already seeing the TLP, kind of effectively winning on an ideological agenda. It's proven itself in just the last few years to really bring the blasphemy issue to the center, and that is different from these patron-client relations that I'm talking about. Even though, not entirely different, because the TLP does also provide, but it is still an ideological platform. So whether or not, because of urbanization and other, feudalism, ties breaking, Biradrism, ties breaking, all of that, whether we see this move towards more ideological politics, maybe. But I don't think the change is vast enough or quick enough right now to be sufficient for PTI victory in the future. And then just very quickly on the diaspora, I definitely think that it's interesting phenomenon, right, to see this real surge of support for the PTI in the diaspora. Kind of consistent, I think, with the support of Modi among the Indian diaspora, right? So populist narratives sell. I think there's a whole host of research agendas to be done around this question about why it is that these sell. But definitely, I think an important thing for us to keep in mind, especially as I think the conversation around overseas voting continues and develops.
Great, thank you so much, Niloufer. Yasser, Maryam, did you want to add anything? We can also keep moving along if not, but just in case.
No, I think I've spoken too much, so I'm going to pause.
Okay, all right. So there's a couple of questions that are really interesting about what this means for voters, but from a slightly different lens than we've been thinking of in the conversation so far. And these come from Shikhar Singh and Sana Malik. So Shikhar, I'm going to go ahead and put you on the panel. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, go ahead.
Thank you to the panel for this opportunity. Do you think recent events or politics since 2018, for those of us that are studying comparative politics, have made voters more polarized in Pakistan, and have recent events actually turned citizens more so into partisans? And since this is a global phenomenon, could you maybe speak to how the Pakistani experience with polarization or hyper-partisanship shares similarities or differences compared to other contexts from the perspective of democratic accountability and the conduct of foreign policy? Thank you.
Thank you, Shikhar. Sana Malik, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. So I was just wondering, I heard a few of you mention the term anti-politics, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate on how exactly that is being used, because my mind sort of jumps to a very specific use of it in social theory. And perhaps in reference to that, when you think of anti-politics, is it sort of, in the case of the PTI voters or PTI supporters, I wonder, sort of beyond the cult of personality that Imran Khan brings, what are the other sort of forms of social control that are at play, which produces a particular type of PTI supporter or voter? And I was wondering if the media or other institutions would play a role in that. And if you could just maybe talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anybody who wants to start us off on those questions, which I think are really important ones about the environment of polarization, what that means for partisan identity in Pakistan, and then how kind of this narrative of anti-politics fits into that landscape. Yeah, go ahead, Yasser.
Yeah. I think that, those are great questions. And one thought I'm very interested in this idea of anti-politics and depoliticization. And I thought I'd clarify the way at least I understand it is that I think there's this idea, and we find this in a lot of populists around the world, whether it's Imran Khan or some of the European populists or even Bolsonaro, this idea that political parties and partisan politics, right, is fundamentally ill-equipped to handle the problems of society, either because these political parties are corrupt or too far removed from this public, or just beholden to vested interests, right? Or in this case now, foreign interests, right? And therefore they cannot be trusted with the decisions related to the day-to-day lives of the people. And therefore we need to place important government decisions at one remove or away from the control of the political class, of political institutions, right? So when we say depoliticization, we talk about the idea in Pakistan like bureaucracies, bureaucratic decision-making, governance decisions should be kept outside the realm of partisan politics and party politics, because parties are fundamentally flawed, corrupted, compromised institutions, right? And we've seen, whether it's Trump's during the swamp rhetoric or Imran Khan's rhetoric, it's premised on the same idea that we need to move beyond party politics and in order to make these decisions. And in Pakistan, this is not new. This is what the military has used as its key reason or rationale for intervention since Ayub Khan's era. You sometimes read the newspapers of the early years of Imran Khan and they match almost word to word the newspaper headlines of 1958 and 59, right? And I think the reason is because the same mantra was produced during both of these periods, but Imran Khan gave a popular base for those ideas, right? And I think that's important because going on to the thought of polarization, I think others can speak to that as well. I think we will see a lot of populists around the world like Imran Khan thrive on this kind of polarization, thrive on this division of society into enemy camps. And now he's moved it beyond I'm corrupt to I'm clean and they're corrupt to I'm Pakistan and they're anti-Pakistan, right? They're foreign colluders, right? How this resonates, though, will be interesting to see. He's going to drive this polarizing narrative. but how it resonates remains to be seen. Because I mean, I think it was Umair Javed, a scholar who wrote this somewhere or said this somewhere, was that when Nawaz Sharif was removed, right, he went on this Mujhe Kyun Nikala campaign, why was I removed? And this had a lot of traction in cities that Nawaz Sharif was popular in, but the rural, semi-rural, urban, semi-urban voter was not that moved by this electorally. And so this kind of sympathy vote backlash and this kind of partisan creation, partisan identity, it will be important to see, and I think Niloufer can speak to this well, will Imran Khan's campaign of why was I taken out resonate in the same, or fall apart in the same way that Nawaz Sharif's did outside the cities as well? So that's something I would love to hear also other panelists' thoughts on as well.
I could just jump in here on this point of populism and polarization. So, I agree entirely with Yasser that, populists kind of thrive on polarization, right? So the whole idea of populism is to present yourself as a political outsider. And in the process of doing so, you're creating this narrative of us versus them, right? And so it's the us that is the true voice of the nation and the true voice of the average citizen. And the them is the political elite, or it's the foreigners or the outsiders or what have it. And so, as far as insofar as populism challenges an inherently unequal status quo, then it's not necessarily bad, right? But what we see is populist leaders engaging in authoritarian or undemocratic acts, and they do so by justifying it or framing their actions as being against the elites. And so this is exactly what we are seeing, is this as Yasser said, this populist narrative now tying into anti-Western narratives and claiming legitimacy of being Pakistani and the legitimate voice of the Pakistani, right? And so I don't want to repeat myself, but I think that whether or not this sells beyond a certain segment of society, I think remains to be seen. But I think this, I do think that the survey data shows that partisanship is growing in Pakistan, right? So you do have this, consistent supporters, not of course in the extent to which, we see it in the Western world, but a real shift, I think, has occurred. And I think the swell of support we saw on Sunday is an example of partisan support as well. And I do think that, how this develops, it's not, I guess my point is, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We do want to see parties getting stronger. We want them to become more institutionalized. We want partisanship to grow at some level, but we don't want to do it at the expense of, as someone I think mentioned, post-truth politics or something, right? And so I think it's a fine line, and it'll be interesting to see how it develops.
Thank you both. Also the way that things have unfolded, the shifting of the election from being a potential space for accountability on government performance. Once again, we have a situation where it looks like it might be a mandate on the legitimacy of the way in which a government was removed, right? This was also the sloganeering of Mujhe Kyun Nikala in 2018. We have things going in a similar direction for the next general elections for a different government this time. And I think in all of this, we are, perhaps even in this conversation, haven't talked a lot about PTI's governance record. And so there are a couple of questions on this. And one of them is from, Mohammed Zainul Abidin. And then there's another one from Imad Rashid on particular reforms that the PTI promised in campaigns and delivered on in terms of extending voting rights to overseas voters and EVMs. So I'm going to turn to each of them to go ahead and pose their questions. Just a moment while I get that set up. I actually don't see Mohammed in the attendees anymore, so let me turn to Imad Rashid to ask his question. Go ahead, Imad.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you for a great conversation. I think a lot of sanity given all the hyperbole we see on Twitter. So my question is basically, what is the panel's opinion on the focus of the new government on rolling back the PTI ordinances on EVMs, overseas voters, etc.? And given that this has been preempted as an agenda by PTI already. Does the panel feel that these changes would be counterproductive optics for these new parties? And objectively, I'm also interested in understanding if the panel thinks these changes in themselves make for good democratic progression on their own. So yeah, three-part question, I guess.
Thank you, Imad. And I also just want to make space for the question on the PTI's achievements while in power, right? And so the original question asker has pointed to Pakistan's strong response to COVID-19 even before the vaccination drive. And in a sense, by focusing on the aspects of the hybrid regime, what are we losing even in this conversation that might actually be quite important for voters and PTI's support base? Maryam, did you want to come in on the question of electoral reforms at all?
Well, actually, no, because that's not really a focus, of my work. But maybe I can add a few words on the polarization aspect and the sort of partisan nature of future elections. I don't know though if somebody would like to take the questions about electoral reform first, so I can always kind of park my comments for later. Okay, never mind. So I was just going to add into the mix a really crucial part of the electoral and political debate, which I think remains on the margins in this conversation, and that has to do with the federation. So I think the fact that Pakistan is a federation, and I argue it's actually very largely an ethnic federation, even though, there's been a lot of cross-provincial migration and the ethno-linguistic diversity that we saw 2 decades ago has obviously shifted. I don't know have the specifics on that, but I will say that provincial power has become fairly entrenched. So you see that with the local government debate, where it's very hard now to actually delegate powers, any kind of even administrative powers to the local level, precisely because there is this feeling at the political party level that as soon as you begin to relinquish powers from the province, it will be very easy for the center to centralize. It has taken us decades actually to reach a point where we could actually have a consensus on something like the 18th Amendment, which devolved, a large majority of the powers from the center to the provinces. And so one factor that I think we're missing out on is the ethno-linguistic factor here. And I think it's been very powerful. It still remains powerful and emotive. It obviously is layered over materialist interests and grievances. Those remain. It remains a powerful identity marker, particularly outside of the Punjab. So when we're talking about, nationalist sort of chest thumping electoral agendas, those typically historically have worked very well in urban Punjab, I would say. They've also worked well in urban Sindh and Karachi because they have a mix of communities. Imran Khan's and PTI's brand of nationalism probably also appeals to the Pakhtun communities in Karachi and in KP. Of course, he's had a decent foothold. But outside of all those areas, it still remains to be seen if these nationalist tropes without the backing of the military are really going to have a lot of political meaning for all these other communities. And I think it would be a mistake to underestimate the question of the federation and the question that, nationalism and nationalistic agendas are often almost exclusively sort of attached to the centralizing imperative of the party at the center, in collaboration with the military. And that is something that, other communities outside of Punjab do not generally fathom or do not generally see as favorable to their own political cause. So I think that given a fair and free election, or a relatively fair and free one, that aspect, I think, is not to be underestimated.
Thank you, Maryam. And I just want to be conscious of time. We're at time. And so unfortunately, we won't be able to get to a really fascinating set of questions. And I just want to acknowledge the themes in those questions about the role of religion as a narrative, which we didn't have a chance to get to. A question from Sohaib Khan that's there. Also questions from Maria Amir and from Sobia Paracha on what this means for other political parties, right? We've talked a lot about the PTI. And so hopefully these are conversations that we'll keep having. But I just want to end by taking the liberty to pose a question that's here from Harmala Khan and also an anonymous attendee, which is maybe in just 30 seconds, each of you we can go around and each of you can say something about how do we strengthen democratic regimes in Pakistan, given the long history of military and judicial interference. And the anonymous attendee's question is, should we vote? This is somebody who's disillusioned about voting. So I'm just going to turn to each of you, maybe just in the order that I see you on the screen to give closing 30 seconds of remarks on that. So Fahd, let's start with you on this.
Okay, I think you know, Maryam said something really nice in her intervention, which was the sort of incremental process of sort of normative improvements in the role that the Constitution plays, and the dignity it's afforded by the citizenry and by political actors. I think that's extremely important for democratic consolidation, and it can't happen overnight. This requires time. In addition to the Constitution, I think another arena from where democratic consolidation can flow is the respect that's afforded to Parliament from within Parliament itself. And so both under the PTI and under the PMLN before the PTI, we saw that, you know, the Prime Minister at the time, when Nawaz Sharif, then Imran Khan, didn't really attend Parliament. There wasn't a lot of, you know, sort of like responding to questions, even though Imran Khan had came in promising like a Westminster style question hour. I think there needs to be, currently with the opposition having now resigned from the Parliament, I'm not sure whether this particular moment in time is going to allow Parliament to sort of, you know, function the way Parliament is supposed to. But I think democratic consolidation really requires that sort of aisle crossing, you know, building of coalitions and consensus and negotiation. That's really important. And the final point that I would add is, I think in a weakly institutionalized democracy such as Pakistan, the one factor which is extremely important for democratic consolidation and which isn't often discussed enough is civil-military coordination. Because I think that there's this assumption that civilian supremacy means keeping the military out of the room, and that's how we can sort of tick mark the box of, you know, being a fully consolidated democracy. But I think in Pakistan, that's a recipe for coups. It's really important to have the military, to consult with the military in order for the sort of existing system to not regress.
Thank you, Fahd. Niloufer, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much to say except yes, absolutely vote. I think this is absolutely the most important thing that any individual can do. You know, aside from also participating in civil society organizations that, you know, promote issues that are important to you. And as to who you should vote for, which is, I think, a question you also posed in the Q&A, I do think that, you know, choosing what is least negotiable for you is important, right? And so whatever it is that brings people to vote, I think as long as we see high vote turnout, I think that incremental progress is really just what we want to see. And I don't think that there's anything about Pakistani politics that I see today that like makes me lose hope on the future for democracy, right? And so I don't think that the outcome of this panel hopefully should be that we are hopeless. I do think there's a lot of openings that, the other panelists have pointed to as well. And so, yeah, and so as I think someone mentioned also, these panels themselves are an example of the ways in which these openings are available to society. And hopefully, like together we can make this sort of, step-by-step forward movement, which is all we're really hoping for.
Thank you so much, Niloufer. Yasser, go ahead.
Sure. So, I thought I'd use this opportunity to, I think, also take into account what one you mentioned in the previous questions about, the PTI and not acknowledging or not acknowledging its successes, right? And it's true, right? The PTI has had certain successes worth acknowledging, particularly the way the NCOC may have dealt with the COVID crisis, the vaccination rollout, etc. But I think what made some of those programs work is essentially the lesson we need to take about what the other aspects of the PTI's government did not work and what we need to see therefore happen in the future, right? What made it work was a better relationship between the key institutions of government that were engaged with the work of the NCOC, right? That will engage with the work of the COVID rollout, COVID campaign and with the vaccination rollout. And what ultimately undermined the ability of that kind of coherent governance to emerge in other aspects of government was, in my opinion, at least partly, a product of the anti-corruption agenda of this government, right? The constant prioritization of going after bureaucrats, politicians, anyone who was in some way deemed to be dissenting or collaborating or having a past affiliation with the political parties of the past, right? And that fixation on removing bureaucrats, undermining institutions as part of that program of anti-corruption really made governance very incoherent and dysfunctional in this period. So if there's anything that we can hope for in the future, is a lesson is learned from that. The kind of politics surrounding witch hunts and anti-corruption witch hunts against your opposition parties is something we need to see curtailed in the future. And I think this is one of the agendas that has brought the whole political coalition we're seeing together on board, is like, let's bring reforms to prevent that kind of witch hunting to happen again. And I hope they take heed of that, right? We've seen Shahid Khaqan Abbasi say we need to dismantle NAB or reform these institutions, and I strongly agree. We need a different approach to politics that isn't about recriminations and revenge against from one party to the other and purging of our institutions of anyone with political affiliations we dislike. That can make for better governance and governing, and maybe we'd see more success like we saw with the vaccination rollout replicated in other governing outcomes as well.
Thank you so much, Yasser. Maryam, go ahead. You have the last word.
That's actually too much pressure. But I think what I would say is that, the solution always to the crisis of democratic backsliding or any other crisis is really more democracy, more constitutionalism. The solution is not retreating from an institution, not relinquishing space in institutions, like Yasser is saying, actually, and taking a leaf from Iqbal Ahmed's book, which is organize, organize, organize. There is absolutely no substitute for that. The moment you retreat, you actually let go of the space that you already had to some extent and were disillusioned with, and then you're left with practically nothing. So I think it's really important to try and kind of maybe take a mental break every now and then, but never to relinquish that space, to work with institutions, to engage the state and its institutions. So you will find that there are a few struggles on the ground, which sort of eschew engagement with the state and its institutions. And I think that that is a huge mistake. I think that that space needs to actually be sort of engaged with, you remain in conversation. There will be phases of backsliding, but you'll need to come back with a fresh mind and energy to kind of reclaim that space. If you feel disillusioned today with what has happened, then the best solution to that is actually to go out there and vote. And actually, I see in the past 20 odd years perhaps that I have been voting, this is the first time that I'm seeing a number of other interesting small party options. And it doesn't have to be the case that you have to always vote for a party that you think is going to win. I think that it's always a good idea to kind of at times think about ideology, think about those sorts of aspects as well, not always cold strategy and calculation. And these smaller political movements actually offer you a chance to go and work with them and actually contribute to molding their political agendas. So I think at some level, if you start looking beneath the surface of this sort of mega politics, you'll realize that there is a lot of political work to be done, and people are doing that despite the odds, and they're doing them in very sort of interesting and important collectives. So I think, I hope that that is a positive note that I'm ending on. But thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful opportunity to engage with you all.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of the panelists for making time for this on such short notice, the South Asia Studies Council for creating space, and especially to all of the audience members for listening in, for engaging, for asking really fascinating and thought-provoking questions that I hope we can continue to talk about in future events. And apologies to the questions that we didn't get to, and apologies for going 10 minutes over time. Thank you all, and hope to see you soon. Bye.